All right, so today we have Dr. Shemmassian, and can you share with our audience what do you do and who you help?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me. So for nearly 20 years, been assisting students with applications to top colleges and medical school and graduate programs. And I'm excited to chat with you today about every aspect of med admissions.
What got you into this field?
Honestly, pretty organic. So I went to a very small high school in Los Angeles and had very little in the way of college application support and was really self-taught to navigating that process. And when I was able to get into college, really learning about the pre-med application process and helping a lot of people along the way. So like I said, I went to a very small high school where it was really a matter of going to a great school locally, like in LA, whether a UCLA or a USC. But then for folks who were looking to go to schools outside of that, there wasn't really much in the way of guidance. And so was self-taught there. And along the way, people just started asking me for help, saying, "Hey, you were able to make X, Y, and Z happen. Could you assist me as well?" And when they were able to achieve their own success, they were telling others. And so there was word of mouth. And eventually, when the requests were getting to be a lot and I was really enjoying the work and people were having success, decided to move into the space. And now I've been doing it full time for quite some time.
Awesome. So I saw your YouTube channel, and I know you do a lot of other video content and strategies and things like that. But it looks like the
Mhm.
specialty really lies in the medical application process. And so, why that particular area?
Yeah, so I've always had an interest in healthcare. When I was going through college, I was, pre-med and helped a lot of students, navigate that process. And so it's a very complex admissions process. So folks who are, familiar with the college admissions process know that, there are essays you have to write and there's school selection you have to do and all this kind of stuff. But when it comes to medical school admissions, it's a whole different ball game because the applications are way larger, so you have to produce a lot more. But also the competition is very cutthroat, but in a different way. When it comes to college admissions, you're really looking at where you're going to go. It's ultra rare that a student doesn't get into any school, right? In other
Hmm.
words, it's a question of where I'm going to get in. With medical school, it's a completely different value proposition, which is if I'm going to get in anywhere, right? Because for MD programs in the US, nearly 60% of people don't get in anywhere in a given application cycle. So most people aren't able to get into an MD program. They might have to go to a DO program or an osteopathic medical school, or maybe look to the Caribbean or look to reapply and stuff like that. And so I was just noticing that a lot of students just don't really know how to navigate that admissions process. They know they have to get great research experiences, get great extracurriculars, and so on. But then when it comes to actually producing talking about their narrative and sharing it with these different med schools, they kind of draw blanks. And a lot of our students, who apply to medical schools, they've done very well in the sciences, but they don't really take as much in the way of humanities and writing and all this kind of stuff. So now these schools are asking them to do something that they have such little practice in. And it's like, "Oh, tell me about yourself, write a personal narrative." And they're like, "I can help you with physics equations, but it's been so long I've written about myself." So it's just a completely different process and presents unique challenges, but it's just such a treat to help students, achieve a goal where, if they don't get in, they won't be able to pursue their career. It's not like there's an alternative option to being a physician, right? So you have to go to medical school. And I just really love helping students tackle that challenge.
Awesome. So, what is your secret to helping students get accepted into med school?
Yeah, I mean, so there are a lot of layers to that question. Sometimes I laugh. I say medical school admissions is not complicated. It's hard though. In other words,
Hmm.
like all the what you need to do is fairly straightforward. Get great grades, do well on the MCAT, pursue really meaningful extracurricular activities, write great essays. Okay, but doing any one of those things well is exceptionally difficult to do. So it's not that there's a secret like, oh my gosh, if you do this like magic thing that nobody else knows about, you're going to be successful. Not at all, but more so doing it well. So for instance, when it comes to extracurricular activities, very similar with college admissions, it's not just about doing a bunch of different things and being quote unquote well rounded, but much more about developing a specialty. So your specialty might be in doing great research or developing these amazing community service initiatives. It might be getting, standout patient exposure experience, and so on and so forth. But sometimes people say, oh, like, so and so is doing this other person is doing that, and I need to follow their footsteps because they seem to know something I don't. And they're sort of, people are sort of on that hamster wheel when it comes to extracurriculars, and then they end up developing a pretty generic profile. So they've checked all the boxes, but nothing actually stands out. Same thing with essays. People look at a bunch of examples online and they say, ooh, like I need an aha moment. Like that's the moment I knew that I wanted to be a doctor. Except, when it comes down to actually writing, your story might not fit that aha moment. So if you try to fit your story into, some model, you try to force that, then you're not going to be in a really good place when it comes to submitting your work.
Sounds a lot like college admission process for high school students.
Yeah, there are a lot of similarities into,
Hmm.
what works well and what doesn't work well. It's just making sure to fit it into that medical school mold. It's just a little more niche, I guess.
Hmm. So I have a lot of students wanting to become a doctor, and
Mhm.
so they want to get into med school and all of those things. And a lot of them say I started volunteering at the hospital. That's where I start, and they firmly believe that volunteering at the hospital is a good enough extracurricular to put on their college application. So, what are your thoughts on volunteering at the hospital? I guess for both undergraduates, high school students, and anyone who's just aspiring to go into med school one day.
Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with volunteering at the hospital.
Yeah.
Now, how good or not good volunteering at the hospital really depends on what you're doing there. Like, if I'm
Mhm.
just like working at the gift shop selling balloons and teddy bears and sympathy cards, like, that's not going to be like, oh my gosh, yes, this kid definitely wants to be a physician. All that kind of stuff. That's not going to be super valuable. Same thing if you're just answering questions at like the info desk or whatever the case might be. So you always have to consider the richness of an experience. Are you actually having direct contact with patients? Are you assisting them, throughout the hospital? Are there special programs where you might be involved in delivering care, maybe in a hospital or in a community clinic or whatever the case might be? Also at the hospital, are there other opportunities? Can you shadow physicians? Can you observe and ask questions? Can you join grand rounds? Is there a way, if it's part of an academic medical center, to get involved in research, right, and to push forward that kind of thing? Or maybe you notice that in the hospital there's something missing. For instance, let's say there are some kids who are there on longer stays, and you've noticed that like they don't have as great recreation as they could have, or something for the families who are waiting there. Maybe you develop that opportunity. So you realize that like these questions oftentimes aren't black and white. Like volunteering at the hospital, good or bad? It's not good or bad. It's just what about it? What are you doing there? And so you have to take a few steps back and think, okay, what am I really excited about? Where do I want to develop my specialty? And then think, okay, if I volunteer at this hospital, are there opportunities available to me where I can develop that profile or not? Is there a closed door? Well, maybe you're going
Mhm.
to do your healthcare experience in the community through an initiative you develop. Maybe it's you figure out that the population you want to serve is, I don't know, uh, Armenian Americans. I'm Armenian, so I'll just, use my example. And you want to help to reduce the like mental health stigma in that community. Okay, well, that's how you would, figure out what to do extracurricularly versus just say, I want to go into medicine. I should volunteer at a hospital. I
Mhm.
think that's a little too generic thinking rather than thinking about what specific community and what problem you want to address.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. And sometimes just pass and just saying no to an opportunity is okay. Like
Yep.
if you end up getting an opportunity at a hospital, but the tasks do not align with what you want to learn more about, then
Hmm.
it's okay to say no.
Yep.
And that eventually leads you to a better opportunity that you truly want.
Yeah.
So a lot of our students, I guess all of our students and parents who listen to our podcast and watch our YouTube channel, they're high school students. And so what advice do you have for high school students and parents and knowing that their ultimate goal is to get accepted into med school? Like what should they be doing right now?
Yeah. So obviously it depends on what stage someone's in. Like if someone's in ninth grade, it's the opportunities available to them are going to be very different than if they're in 11th grade, because certain opportunities, whether it's like summer programs or internships, might be available to students who are a little bit older. So parents oftentimes are super confused about what like a ninth or 10th grader might do, because they're a little bit younger. So they say, should I do this summer program or this other thing? Or no one's hiring someone so young, and they feel like, well, then it's not available. So I think that depending on how much time you have, you can consider, again, where you are in that college admissions funnel, so to speak. So if somebody's in ninth grade, even 10th grade, it's okay to spend more time exploring a few different options that you think you might be super interested in for many years, and then see if that's actually the case. So a lot of times with a freshman student, you might recommend, all right, well, let's get involved in a few different areas. Which of these do you like the most? Okay, what about it do you like? I think that question doesn't get asked enough. What about
Mm.
it? Because if someone says, well, I love like teaching, or I love helping people have healthcare access or something like that, what you would choose to do would be very different, right? Depending on how you answer those questions. And so over time, you essentially keep, going down that funnel, asking yourself the question, what you like and why, and going from there. Now, if it's somebody who's in 11th grade and maybe, they're looking to apply to, BSMD programs or, pre-med programs at top schools, and let's say they don't have research experience yet, well, that might be the clear gap in their profile. So they might
Mm.
seek to get like an internship over the summer, or do a summer program, or work at a university or something like that. Whether someone who has more time could work to develop a multi-year program where they serve their community's healthcare needs, and so on and so forth. So depends on when you start working on this stuff, what you've done in the past, and what opportunities there are given the time you have remaining.
Mhm. And so you mentioned BSMB programs, and I
Mhm.
kid you not, we have so many students saying, I want to get into a BSMB program. And sometimes I say, yeah, I think you'd be a really good fit for it based on the extracurricular list you have and stats you have.
Mhm.
And so, what's a good checking process or checking point that students could use to assess whether they would truly be a good fit for the program, BSMB program, plus whether they are pretty qualified to be in the
Yeah.
game?
Yeah, so BSMD programs are super interesting. I hear probably more interest about them today ever before. And so for folks who aren't familiar with that, these are just the direct med programs where you essentially get into a combined undergrad and medical program. Some are 6 years, some are 7 years, some are 8 years long. And I think the growing popularity, Julie, is because medical school admissions has gotten so much more difficult, where I think people are just looking for the surest thing that they can get. Right. So
Mhm.
it's like basically in response to, oh my gosh, like only 40% are getting in. I should do a BSMD program and figure out early on if I want to go. But not all BSMD programs are created equally, first and foremost. So some of them have a true, assured acceptance. Other ones have minimum requirements. So you have to get a minimum GPA, a minimum MCAT score, and those thresholds are creeping up every year. And then you have some drama where schools promise something early on, and then they say, actually, we're changing our policy. So please, everyone out there, do your research on these specific programs that you might want to attend. And then, you have to figure out a student's level of confidence about wanting to go to medicine, because some BSMD programs are affiliated with very prestigious undergrads. Other BSMD programs are affiliated with less prestigious undergrads. So that really matters, because let's say I go to, the top two, or the ones that everyone's dying to go to, are Brown, PLME, as well as the Rice Baylor program. And those are great because let's say you change your mind, midway through undergrad, and you're like, I don't want to be a physician. Well, you're still at Brown or Rice, and that's tremendous. And then there are other programs, if you get in, if you change your mind, you might not be in as strong of an undergrad institution. So maybe I say, actually, I want to study history. Well, if you're at not to name specific names or anything like that, because it's not about that, but you have to be mindful of where you might be. Now, if you're ultra confident, you might say, well, that's fine. My goal is the assurance. I'm prioritizing assurance over brand name. So I'm going to go to the BSMD programs that take me. And so I think that, definitely in 10th, 11th grade, do a temperature check. Not just do I want to go to med school, yes or no, but what is like, how strong of a desire is this? Is this something that's been going on for years, or is it sort of like a flash in the pan? Like, yeah, I think I want to be I think that sounds good, right? You don't want to necessarily commit to BSMD programs there. Also, sometimes I've noticed, really, I'm sure you've observed this too, where students will go to BSMD programs and they do exceptionally well there, and they're like, I kind of want to apply out of this BSMD programs because I think I can get into an even better medical school. Except now my undergrad isn't super prestigious. How much of a problem is this? So you have to weigh those kinds of things as well. Now, what makes somebody good for a BSMD program or not? I mean, again, great grades, great test scores. Typically, schools will say what their expectations are for their numbers, but then developing a pre-med profile, right? So having experience with shadowing, ideally having patient exposure experience, having strong research experiences, and then community service experiences, because essentially they're looking to see, okay, this 17, 18-year-old applicant, have they shown us a commitment to the field? Is their desire strong enough? Not like a 6 months before applying thing, like for years. Do they have a track record where we can feel pretty confident this person is not only going to stick with medicine, but they're going to push forward? Because the assurance is really to give students flexibility to pursue whatever it is that they want during undergrad, to not feel tied down in any way by quote unquote pre-med responsibilities. So they want to know, okay, are we getting not only rock stars into our program, but people who were reasonably confident are going to stick with this and use the flexibility to make an even bigger impact when they come to our school. So that's the narrative that we have to see just based on your application materials.
Mhm. Yeah. You mentioned earlier that, getting into med school is pretty straightforward, but it's hard.
Mhm.
So how can students work on that standout factor? Like they are doing all the things, right? Getting good grades, good MCAT scores and things like that. But what is like that one selling tipping point that you think works really well in helping them getting accepted to med schools?
Yeah, just like you said, I mean, similar to college admissions, developing that spike is so crucial. Like, for instance, some of our medical school applicants, they will be tremendously skilled when it comes to research. They'll have worked in multiple labs, 2000 plus hours of research experience, multiple letters from PIs in their lab. And then they'll be good enough when it comes to service and patient exposure and so on. Another student might have the complete flip, right, where they're solid with research. They've done their work for a year, 2 years, they have significant experience, but really their calling card is tremendous service background. Maybe they
Mm.
worked with kids who were in foster care or something like that, and they identified a need for a change in those policies. And so they got a policy internship with a local politician or their politician back home where they grew up. They came home for the summer. And over time, they work with their, city assemblyman or whoever the case might be. And they work to develop a new policy to amend or take better care of kids in the foster system, something like that. And so their profile would look very different from the rock star researchers. I think that sometimes students and parents oversimplify things when it comes to med school admissions. Specifically, they say, ooh, like the top 10 schools or the top 20 schools, these are research schools. And the other schools are more clinical or service schools. And again, it's not that black and white. Like even the top med school, you're talking Harvard Med School, Stanford, UCSF, Hopkins, all this kind of stuff. They don't want just a bunch of people who love being in lab all day long and neglect, the rest of the stuff. No, all of these medical schools are training clinical physicians, and they want people who are exceptional with research. They also want people who are exceptional when it comes to service, some in maybe entrepreneurship to solve major problems in healthcare. And so my advice to students is to not think so narrowly about med school admissions and saying, oh, it must be, I need scribing and research, that's what it takes. Because maybe you have another opportunity to develop just as much of a meaningful profile. And just because sometimes it's hard to quantify the strength of a profile versus, say, I have 3 publications, which is much more tangible, I think people gravitate towards things that they can count. That's why they love grades, they love test scores. I have a great GPA, I have a great test score, I also have 3 publications, what are my chances? Well, There's a lot more to it, but we love to find comfort in numbers because we can feel them, so to speak.
Yeah. With undergraduate college admission process, we're finding that recommendation letters are becoming more and more important.
Mhm.
Do you think that's true in medical
For sure.
application as well? Okay.
For
Yeah.
sure. I mean, if if a rec letter is negative, obviously that's terrible. A neutral letter is basically thrown out. And I think that when it comes to recommendation letters, Julie, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this too. It's like a positive letter is not good it's not just like they came to my class, they got an A, they're among the whatever percent in my class, or that kind of thing, but actually coming up with tangible, like actual examples, to demonstrate why you're using the adjectives you're using. Like for instance, I always tell students, don't just say, hey, like, you know uh, Mrs. So and so, like, could you write a letter of recommendation for me? Because then they're just going to write something generic. So always asking teachers or counselors or whomever why you're asking for a letter from them and how their letter is going to fit with your overall application profile. That's critical. So for instance, rather than saying, hey, would you write me a letter of rec, you might say, hey, like, Mrs. Johnson, um, I'm wondering whether you'd feel comfortable writing a strong letter of recommendation for me. The reason why I would especially value a letter from you is because I think you can uniquely speak to X, Y, and Z. For instance, when you and I worked on project A, da, 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 and this would fit, I think really nicely with what I'm looking to communicate in my essay. Here's a draft for your reference. Thanks so much for your consideration, Jimmy, whatever, right? So now it's not just a generic ask, but asking them to discuss specific things that fit very nicely with what you're also looking to say about yourself. And those are the requests that lead to home run letters.
Right. Yeah. I actually have my students do like a quick meeting with a
Yeah.
recommender before you ask them. Like, don't assume
Hmm.
they're going to write you a rec letter.
Yeah,
And then, yeah, convey why you want that person to write a letter for you. So
exactly.
important. Great. Is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience? Piece of
Boy,
advice?
yeah, I mean, I think just to stay encouraged, as acceptance rates go lower and lower, this is true with both undergrad and medical school admissions. I think that people have, one of two responses. I think some people shut down and they say, like, oh, like with those rates, like this will never work out for me, so I'm not going to try. And so people, well, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because they end up
Mm,
not applying. And then there are other people who, they're like, oh my gosh, like it's getting harder, put my head down, like work, 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 hours, hours, hours. And they don't stop and think about, again, this profile. I think a lot of people hear holistic and they say, yeah, yeah, I get it, but I'm gonna toss that aside and work, 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 work. But like, no, all of this stuff actually matters. Your rec letters matter, your essays matter, your stats matter, extracurriculars. So, feel encouraged by, if you do the right things foundationally, admissions doesn't change that much. Trends
mhm.
change, competition changes, all those things evolve, but foundationally, things don't change that much. So make yourself incomparable, right? And do that in a deliberate way, and you'll be fine.
Love that. Stay encouraged.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being on the show. And where can our audience learn more about you and your services and your social media, everything?
Yeah. So, I mean, folks can get to our site at shemmassianconsulting.com. I'll provide, some links to helpful resources to navigate, the admissions process for med school. And if anyone ever has questions, they can reach out, contact at shemmassianconsulting.com. We'll be glad to assist.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.